LiberalViewer presents.
So, welcome to the April 19th edition of LiberalViewer Sunday Live Clip Roundup. Thanks for joining me. I hope you're staying safe and well. This week I have the 17 best, most newsworthy clips that I picked out from the Sunday morning news analysis shows from the big five corporate outlets of ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, and Fox News, the so-called corporate media here in the United States, for what should be a really informative, educational, fair use media criticism and political commentary show for you all tonight. If you go down into the video description, the first link is to my clip list where you can follow along on the notes I used to remind myself what I was going to say about the clips, and usually I remember to say about half or three-quarters of it if I'm lucky. So if you really can understand my notes, you'll understand more about what I should say about my clips than I actually say. I also have some political comedy, even though this is not really a comedic time with the pandemic, and I think today we crossed the 40,000 death toll. More than 40,000 Americans have died from COVID-19 as of today. And that came up at the news conference that Trump held just an hour or so before my broadcast that I watched in total. Like I watched all of his press conferences in total. And I don't know how anyone could watch all of that Trump like I've watched and not see that he is like a malignant narcissist who should not be leading anything. And actually, my political comedy clip here comes from HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher. It's kind of about leadership skills and more about leadership skills in the past. It's from Bill Maher's interview with Fareed Zakaria, and Fareed Zakaria talks about the post-Cold War crises, the three big ones, and how one is different than the other two, and it's because Obama was a much more logical leader, logical, rational leader, rather than before this clip. Fareed Zakaria talked about people overreacting to crises, like overreacting to 9/11, and you'll see why during this clip I yelled. If you look over my shoulder here, of course I have my Mr. Spock mug, and you'll see why during this clip I yelled a couple times, Mr. Spock, Mr. Spock, and I will talk about that with you a little more after we watch that clip together over here.
I will point out, there are sort of three crises of the post-Cold War world. 9/11, the 2008-2009 financial crisis, and this one. And the distinctive feature of the 08-09 one is we really didn't overreact. And I do think that having a president who was Dr. Spock helped in that regard. Right. Obama is very calm, very cool, very rational, and that some people saw it as a kind of lack of emotion, Dr. Spock. But when you think about it in these terms, it was really helpful to have somebody who doesn't just go with the herd and who sits back and asks himself, what is the right rational answer to this problem?
Well, I think you mean Mr. Spock. Dr. Spock was a pediatrician, and a pediatrician
You're exactly right. You're exactly right.
A pediatrician is deftly what this president needs. But I mean,
we're doing this. We're doing this on the fly.
I know.
That was a pretty good off-the-cuff joke from Bill Maher. I give him a lot of criticism and haven't used a lot of his clips lately, but the pediatrician is what Trump needs because he is a whiny baby, which I like actually better for reasons I discussed many months ago. The whiny baby thing is better than the whiny little bitch thing. That was a Jon Stewart versus Bill Maher video I made many months ago. Whatever, I don't want to go off on that tangent, but one thing I wanted to mention about that analysis is if you are a real Star Trek aficionado, some Trekkie, Trekker, whatever you want to say, you know that Mr. Spock, of course, was not really the best captain or the best leader. If you, especially in the original Star Trek series, you see that the emotional human Captain Kirk is actually the better captain, but Mr. Spock and his logical, rational approach does have its good qualities, unless you're like marooned on some planet, your shuttlecraft is down and you're being attacked by these giant, primitive, like ape-like caveman creatures. That was one of the episodes that showed how the logical, rational approach isn't always the best way of being a leader. And so that was one piece of analysis you're not going to get most places, talking about the leadership style of Obama versus Trump and the Mr. Spock. Many people have referred to President Obama as Mr. No drama Obama, and Mr. Spock. A lot of people did compare him to Mr. Spock, but that might not be the best leadership style, but it's certainly way above what we're getting from Donald Trump. And the next 5 clips I'm going to show you are the big 5 corporate outlet news summaries. And the big topic I'm concentrating on, I didn't say that earlier, is Trump failing on testing. There's kind of a double entendre in my title. Trump fails testing, and his character is being tested, and he's definitely failing the character test. But also, that is one of the big issues from the very start of the way Trump has handled this crisis that is still a problem, and that's what I'm going to show you in most of the clips that are coming up from the news outlets. And you'll see that in all of the news summaries pretty much. That's one of the biases I'll be looking for. But the other important bias to look for when you're looking at these news clips, and I think NBC News' Meet the Press did this best in terms of juxtaposing these protests you see around the country with the actual poll numbers, because I've been to a lot of protests I live in Sacramento, the capital of California, and I'm an activist for civil liberties, civil rights. I do activism with the ACLU, as I've talked about, and I've been to a lot of protests, and you'll see some of these protests talked about dozens of protesters, and dozens of protesters, they don't really represent more than necessarily just a few dozen people. So, some of these protests had like 100 people, but and there's some talk about how they may be astroturfed, funded by people who worked for Betsy DeVos's family and other right-wing organizations trying, this like open up the government and, stopping us, stop prohibiting us from infecting our fellow citizens with coronavirus, which they're basically protesting for the right to infect other people, which is kind of a stupid kind of activism, in my opinion. And you'll see when I get to the Fox News summary, they totally concentrated on it as like this is showing the pressure to reopen the government, and that they've been really harping on that, reopen our country or whatever, reopen the states to end the lockdown. And they've been harping on that on Fox News, and you'll see it on Face the Nation in the news summary I'm going to show you, where I don't think they really put it in the context that you'll see in the NBC News Meet the Press news summary. I will talk about with you a little more, the longest and best news summary as usual. Did I forget to say anything about it? If I look at my notes. And also one of the things they talk about that is talked about a little bit, but should be a big news summary, topic, is how Trump claimed to have total authority and then gave up total authority to the governors all in the last week. And that's kind of what Chuck Todd starts with. Chuck Todd's news summary is the best. His interview is not the best with Mike Pence, that's clip number 9, but this is clip number 2, which I will talk about with you since I've talked way too much already after we watch it together over here.
Good Sunday morning. A week that began with President Trump declaring that his authority was total, ended with the death toll in the United States topping 38,000, and Mr. Trump telling governors it's up to them to decide when to reopen for business. But the president's broad guidelines leave many issues unresolved, like the lack of protective gear for healthcare workers, plans to handle a likely resurgence in the pandemic, and most of all, how to vastly increase the testing and contact tracing needed to safely restart this economy. Mr. Trump is being squeezed by depression-like economic numbers that have prompted some of his allies to argue that losing lives to the coronavirus may be an acceptable price to pay for getting the economy going again. At the same time, he's encouraging anti-social distancing protests by tweeting that states need to be liberated from his very own guidelines. We have a brand new NBC News Wall Street Journal poll on the federal government's handling of the COVID-19 crisis. By a 58-32 margin, registered voters say they're more worried that the U.S. will move too quickly to loosen restrictions than take too long. 65% say President Trump did not take the threat seriously enough at the beginning of the crisis, while just 32% say that he did. Overall, 44% approve of the way President Trump is handling the crisis, while 52% disapprove. And now 50 governors are being told to come up with 50 solutions to a national testing problem, as President Trump tells them, in effect, I'll take the credit for trying to reopen the country, while you take the blame for anything that goes wrong.
The governors are responsible for testing.
President Trump lurching between declaring power
When somebody's the president of the United States, the authority is total.
and denying responsibility.
It's going to be up to the governors.
After promising on Thursday
We are not opening all at once, but one careful step at a time.
On Friday, the president fueled reopening protests in a handful of states, with Democratic governors tweeting, "Liberate Minnesota, Michigan, and Virginia."
I hope that it's not encouraging more protests.
I do not have time to involve myself in Twitter wars.
I'd like to know what they think we could have done differently, because, again, we're leading as we were asked. We flattened the curve. We built up our PPE. We've kept Minnesotans alive.
Mr. Trump's tweets come as media on the right is amplifying the protests, and in some cases, conservative groups are organizing and funding them.
This is a great time, gentlemen and ladies, for civil disobedience. We need to be the Rosa Parks here.
More than 22 million Americans applied for unemployment benefits in the past month, nearly 10 times the previous record, set in 1982. In a new NBC News Wall Street Journal poll, just 22% say the economy is excellent or good, down from 53% in December. But even Trump-friendly Republican governors have been slow to embrace the president's call to lift statewide stay-at-home orders.
In opening Texas, we must be guided by data and by doctors.
I wanted to come here today and announce that we can all ease up and reopen, but we can't.
Just 36% of voters trust what the president has said about the coronavirus, compared to 66% who trust their own governors and 69% who trust the CDC. And 64% are not satisfied with the federal government's actions on testing. After months of promises,
Anybody that needs a test gets a test. They're there.
only about 3.7 million tests have been conducted, an average of 146,000 per day, far short of what experts say is required for reopening. The president once promised a national testing website and widespread testing in drugstore parking lots.
You'll be directed to one of these incredible companies that are going to give a little bit of their parking lot so that people can come by and do a drive-by test.
Now, a month later,
Federal government's supposed to do testing of parking lots in the middle of a certain state that's 2,000 miles away. It's ridiculous.
and now President Trump is trying to shift the blame, tweeting, the states have to step up their testing.
He said 11 times, I don't want to get involved in testing. It's too complicated. It's too hard. I know it's too complicated and it's too hard. That's why we need you to help.
And joining me now from the White House is Vice President Mike Pence. Mr. Vice President.
And like I said a lot of good things about that news summary before I showed it. One thing that's good in there is it talks about promises that Trump and Pence made in the past about testing that haven't come true. That whole like Google website. Actually, one of them showed up in Sacramento, but there were just like a few of them in Northern California where you, and I talked long ago about how I tried to get tested and couldn't get tested. I'm still waiting for a good antibody test. I think if you go back to my show on, what was it, like mid-March show, where I did a show where I was like sick, and I think there's a significant chance it was coronavirus, but I didn't have the severe symptoms that allow testing. You still can't get tested in a lot of places, and so that promise that, you know, you'd be able to go to a Walgreens parking lot and get tested everywhere in the country or whatever it was that Mike Pence and promised, and then Trump said, why would the federal government be taking care of a parking lot somewhere out in the middle of the country? Or that was two good clips there. Never came up in the Mike Pence interview that Chuck Todd did. He didn't bring up that clip. He didn't bring up all the promises they made. You know, you'll see when I do clip number 9, Mike Pence talking to Chuck Todd about testing. You know, he does this thing. You know, we're at like 4 million tests, and we're at 3 million tests. We're gonna get to 4 million tests. But if you go back and look at what they promised like 27 million tests by the end of March, and they're getting like 4 or 5 million by the end of April. And why aren't journalists like Chuck Todd, and I'm going to show Chris Wallace also from Fox News Sunday had Mike Pence on, very weak interview. Sometimes Chris Wallace does commit some journalism on Fox News. I don't know if it's a crime on Fox News to commit journalism, but it is like a right-wing propaganda outlet for the Republicans, as you can read about in The Loudest Voice in the Room, how it was created for that purpose, that book over there by Gabriel Sherman, which I'm not going to go into. But Chris Wallace sometimes does commit journalism. I don't think he committed a lot of journalism this week, which I will get to when I get to that clip number 10, which comes after those are the 2 Mike Pence clips. I have a couple Nancy Pelosi clips, and then I have a whole bunch of governor clips talking about how they can't get the reagents for testing, they can't get the swabs for testing. They need the federal government to use the Defense Production Act to force companies or to go into the foreign supply chains to get the reagents, to get the testing. I'll talk more about reagents and testing, but I've been talking too long and I want to get to some more news summaries. I still have 4 more. This next one is ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos. It's very short. It's like 55 seconds. It has the bias of I've talked about, I just talked about how Fox News is like a propaganda outlet for Republicans. It has political partisan bias, but the rest of the corporate news media has bias of like sensationalism, of both sidism or two-sidism, when one side is true and one side is false. The flat earthers and the non-flat earthers get equal treatment on a lot of the corporate news media. They have corporate bias, they don't like to upset their sponsors, or huge corporate, like they have the corporate military industrial complex mindset on a lot of foreign policy issues. That's corporate. The corporate media is not liberal. It's it's conservative in a lot of ways. And then for sensationalism, I said that already. And they also have this bias for when they have an exclusive guest, or Nancy Pelosi wasn't even an exclusive guest, but you'll see this whole news summary is a bridge to the Nancy Pelosi interview, which is better from George Stephanopoulos than Chuck Todd. And I'm going to show wait. Right, do I have... Yeah. And I do have a George Stephanopoulos, Nancy Pelosi clip. I was confusing with my... and anyway, this actually plays all the way through to Nancy Pelosi. It's only a minute long, which I will talk about with you a little more after we watch it together over here.
Good morning and welcome to This Week. As we come on the air this morning, the coronavirus continues to spread. Now more than 730,000 cases across America. And as the fight to contain the virus goes on, the White House, Congress, and governors also now focused on containing the economic devastation caused by the pandemic, struggling with how to reopen society without risking a second wave of the virus. At the White House last night, the president stepped up his attacks on House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, claiming she's blocking new funding for the Paycheck Protection Program for small business.
Nancy Pelosi is blocking it. She sits in her house in San Francisco, overlooking the ocean, and she doesn't want to come back. She doesn't want to come back.
That is where we began when I spoke with the Speaker yesterday. Madam Speaker, thank you very much for joining.
And why is that where George Stephanopoulos... I didn't even take that clip where, like, his first question to Nancy Pelosi was, what do you think about all of Trump's insults of you? Is that the most important issue in the middle of a pandemic? I understand they haven't spoken for months. That actually might be an important question, which he didn't ask. Nobody asked Nancy Pelosi in her 2 interviews about not speaking to Donald Trump for months, but in the middle of a huge national crisis. I kind of side with Nancy Pelosi over Donald Trump, though I'm going to criticize some of her answers a little bit later. But I want to finish up my news summaries. The next news summary is the last one that I would say is actually good, that isn't biased. The CBS News Face the Nation, I've sometimes said, is Fox News Light, and I think they live up to that this week when they cover the protests. Here you'll see, did I say I like the scary map that they showed at the beginning of the ABC News Summary? That's in my notes. But Jake Tapper starts off State of the Union this week saying, what is our State of the Union? It is waiting for relief. And he talks about how it's only been 50 days since the first coronavirus death in the United States. And talks about how he was told by the Trump administration on that day that we're ready, and we definitely weren't ready. And then there's a good graph of, it's not like the scary map you saw from ABC, but a good graph showing what's been happening with coronavirus, and a good end on the lack of testing, which I will discuss with you a little more after we watch that clip together over here.
Hello, I'm Jake Tapper in Washington, where the State of our Union is waiting for relief. Today marks 50 days. 50 days since the first coronavirus death in the United States, a day on which the Vice President of the United States told me, quote, "We're ready." It is now devastatingly clear we were not ready. More than 39,000 Americans are dead as of this minute, a number that has nearly doubled in just the last week. It's a toll that has left the nation desperate for relief from the ongoing public health crisis and mounting economic losses. In the public health battle, there are more encouraging signs that social and physical distancing measures are working to flatten the curve in the nation's hotspots. But governors in states across the country say they still do not have the testing needed to safely begin reopening, despite the Trump administration's assurances that testing is, quote, sufficient. On the economic front, the numbers are frankly overwhelming. More than 22 million Americans have filed for unemployment in the last month. On Thursday, the program designed to help rescue small businesses ran out of money, leaving desperate people at the mercy of ongoing political negotiations between the Trump administration and Democratic leaders on Capitol Hill. And let's start there. Joining me now, the Treasury Secretary Stephen Mnuchin. Secretary Mnuchin.
And I did not take a Stephen Mnuchin clip, although at a link down in the video description, you can follow the link to CNN's State of the Union, and I believe you can watch the interview between Jake Tapper and Steve Mnuchin there if you're interested in. It was mostly about, the reason I didn't take clips is because I'm covering the testing issue, Trump's failure on testing, and that was almost completely about the past legislation and the current legislation, and if there's going to be a deal, excuse me, on that's going to put more money into the PPP program that gives loans to small businesses, although some of the businesses weren't so small, and that was, I don't want to go into all that, although it's an important topic, but not the topic I'm covering. Most of my clips are on the testing issue, and I like how Jake Tapper did cover the testing issue in his news summary there. The next clip is CBS News' Face the Nation, which I earlier said I sometimes refer to as Fox News Light. I don't know how that happened with CBS, because they're not like Fox News, as you see in The Loudest Voice in the Room, that book I keep pointing to, which is actually a propaganda outlet for Republicans and now Trump TV. But CBS News is not that. I actually grew up listening to CBS News radio before I watched all these news programs on TV, so I'm a little disturbed by that. And there's actually a lot of good journalism going on CBS, and I'm actually going to show you just Margaret Brennan's brief introduction and then the news summary from Mark Strassman, that the reason I think, or my criticism that aligns with my Fox News Light analysis, is that they really exaggerate the protests, as I was talking about earlier. On Meet the Press, they juxtapose the protests with a poll showing that 2/3 of Americans are actually more worried about opening up businesses and getting rid of the stay-at-home orders too quickly, compared to 1/3 who are represented by these protesters, I guess. But you won't hear that in the Face of the Nation news summary. One good thing they do is, that's the Mark Strassman report from Atlanta talking about what's going on in the United States. I keep playing this till you see Elizabeth Palmer reporting from London about what's going on in Europe. Excuse me. And then there's an additional report on what's going on in Russia and China. And then later in the program, a report on Syrian refugees, talking to King Abdullah of Jordan, talking about your Star Trek references, because King Abdullah, I believe, had a brief role in Next Generation. But anyway, I will talk about all of that a little more after we watch the CBS News Face the Nation news summary. I'm not going to cover anything after Mark Strassman's news summary. Not Elizabeth Palmer, not the Russia-China thing, not King Abdullah. But those were all good things, but there's a bad thing in this clip that I will talk about a little more, and talked about already too much before I showed it. But anyway, here it is, and I'll talk about it more after we watch it together here.
Welcome to Face the Nation. As America continues to suffer in these troubling times, it's hard to find the right words to begin this broadcast. Today, we thought we'd borrow from one of the country's most prolific writers, Wall Street Journal columnist Peggy Noonan, who wrote yesterday that this is a never-before-seen level of national economic calamity. History doesn't get bigger than this. Sobering words, but true. First up this morning is CBS News national correspondent Mark Strassman. He's in Atlanta. Mark?
Good morning, Margaret. And now comes the tricky part, reversing the great American lockdown. It's every governor's call to make in this historic health crisis. But as job losses mount, so does the pressure to reopen America. Open our state! We want to work! It's America's Corona Revolt. Protesters storming the gates of power.
Refuse to comply.
Backlash in Virginia, in Texas, in California. They've lost jobs. They're fed up with stay-at-home orders. They worry America in lockdown teeters on a second Great Depression. 22 million jobs lost in 4 weeks.
You can't keep healthy people locked in their houses and watch the economy just go down. You can't do it.
Michigan's torn between dollar signs and vital signs.
Facts over fear.
It ranks third nationally in COVID-19 deaths, fifth in overall cases, and no state has bled more jobs. Almost 1 in 4 workers in the last 4 weeks. By May 1st, Governor Gretchen Whitmer promises to review her stay-home restrictions.
I'm frustrated, too. None of us wants to be here in this moment.
But lifting those restrictions prematurely could spread the virus. South Dakota is one of 7 states without a stay-home mandate. This now closed pork processing plant became America's hottest spot for the virus. 769 related cases. In this county, cases nearly tripled in 1 week. More than 100 mayors pleaded with the governor for a stay-home order.
I am not going to do that at this time. I don't believe it's appropriate.
Consider the 43 states with stay-at-home orders. 23 have restrictions that extend to May 1st. The 20 others will continue into May or indefinitely. Phasing out restrictions will vary by state. One major issue, testing. Who's safe to be around? And nothing will return soon to the way it was, like Saturday's commencement at the Air Force Academy. Graduates sitting apart, the stadium empty. But they celebrated progress. The event wasn't canceled. America's reopened economy will have winners and many losers. And thousands of small businesses were counting on the government's loan program. And now it has run out of money. Margaret?
Mark Strassman, thank you. We want to go now to CBS News senior foreign correspondent Elizabeth Palmer in London. Mark.
And like I said, I'm not going to show Elizabeth Palmer talking about what's going on in Europe, including this World War II veteran who went 100 times back and forth across his yard and raised like $16 million. And I think I said all the stuff beforehand. By the way, I was reading the live comments while I was watching the clip with you, and I was corrected. I said that King Abdullah of Jordan was on Star Trek The Next Generation, but no, it was on Star Trek Voyager. Star Trek Voyager. How could I have been so wrong? So thank you to my live commenters for correcting me. That's why I try to read the live comments while I'm watching the clips to get a little bit of feedback from my live viewers. So I appreciate that. And to back up my now, there was a lot of good stuff in there. There was and I said a lot of good things that CBS News Face the Nation did in clips I'm not going to take. And I also have to point out that they were the one of the Sunday morning news analysis shows back in like January, February, who were covering what was going on with coronavirus in China. And I didn't take any of those clips, but I did mention a couple times in my program that in my live stream that CBS News Face the Nation was covering that, and they were either exaggerating the threat, or they were the one news program who was covering the top story. And turns out they were the one Sunday show that was covering the top story before all the other ones. So I have to always give CBS News Face the Nation credit for that. But my criticism about them being Fox News Light has to do with the way they covered the protests and didn't really put it in the context of, a few dozen people showing up at a state capitol doesn't mean that 2/3 of America is worried that we're opening up too fast, while 1/3 are worried about the economic toll, which is real and was covered in the CBS News Face the Nation news summary, but it's also covered very heavily. And look at it compared to the Fox News Sunday news summary, which is all about the protesters and maybe some worries we might open up too fast, but nothing about bad things the president has done about his, I talked about how Meet the Press at the beginning covered Trump saying he has total authority, and then, trying to shift. Basically, his plan is to take credit for everything good that happens, but shift the blame for everything bad that happens to the states or to China or the WHO. China actually does have some blame, and that's something I'll get into when I show the Wuhan origin or oranges of the investigation clip that I'll get to later with Fox News. I think that's clip number clip number 10. That's the Mike Pence clip with Chris Wallace. But here's Chris Wallace doing his introduction and then giving it over to Mark Meredith for their news summary, all about the great unrest in the nation, not put into any context. And anyway, I over-introduced the final news summary, which I will discuss with you after we watch it together over here.
And hello again from Fox News in Washington. The fight over the pace of reopening America is spurring protests across the country. President Trump, who laid out guidelines this week for restarting the economy, siding with some of those protesters and pushing back against governors' calls for help with more testing, saying the responsibility lies with the states. In a moment, we'll speak with the Vice President, Mike Pence, head of the White House Coronavirus Task Force. But first, let's bring in Mark Meredith with the latest on the debate over relaxing some of those restrictions. Mark.
Chris, Americans that are fed up with stay-at-home orders held protests in multiple states, urging their governors to let businesses reopen. But health officials worry reopening too soon could cost thousands of more lives.
We're just here for our freedoms.
Americans coast to coast are speaking out against orders to stay home.
It's absolutely ridiculous. People need to get back to work.
Maryland residents spent Saturday protesting from their cars, while in Texas, dozens chanted, "Fire Fauci." Governors nationwide are trying to calm their constituents.
I'm as frustrated as anybody. I want to get businesses open yesterday.
I'm frustrated too. Like I said, I want this to be over as much as anybody.
President Trump says some protests are legitimate.
I just think that some of the governors have gotten carried away.
In Jacksonville, Florida, hundreds of people were spotted walking the beach only hours after officials eased regulations. In New York, it's a different story.
We're not at a point where we're going to be reopening anything immediately.
New York is reporting a decrease in the number of new hospitalizations, but health experts warn until testing expands sharply, state officials will struggle to determine when it's truly safe for people to return to work. Meanwhile, a government program to help small businesses keep people on payroll is out of money. The president is calling on Congress to refund the program immediately. Democrats say they are willing to do it, but they also want additional money for hospitals and states. Negotiations, Chris, they remain ongoing this weekend. Chris?
Mark Meredith reporting from the White House. Mark, thanks. And joining us now live from...
And like I said, there will be a Mike Pence clip from Fox News Sunday, a weird clip where he asked Mike Pence about this clip of Nancy Pelosi, but not really about what she said in the clip. That's clip 10 coming up. But I'm now going to show you clip 7. If you're following along on the clip list, you can follow the clip list at a link I put in the video description. I think it's the top link there. The first clip I want to show you is Nancy Pelosi, and I don't think Nancy Pelosi did a good job of explaining what's missing from the federal leadership on testing. She doesn't talk about swabs and reagents, which are the two, and you know, the swabs can be produced here in the United States using the Defense Production Act, which Trump in his news conference just an hour or two before I started this broadcast, he said he's going to use the Defense Production Act to get swabs. Swabs are easy, ventilators are hard. He kept saying, I don't know why he kept saying that in his news conference. But the other thing is reagents, which they're like chemicals you need to either like transport the sample once you've collected it or to run the test. And though a lot of those aren't made in the United States, they're made in China. And Trump didn't really talk about that. And Nancy Pelosi doesn't really talk about that. But she does make an important point right at the beginning when George Stephanopoulos asks her about these protests, that basically the point I was making before, that they are, you know, don't exaggerate them. They're a distraction from Trump's failures on testing. I don't think in the details she makes the testing argument very well, as I will discuss with you after we watch that clip together over here.
Of course, is against the backdrop of these staggering jobs losses over the last 4 weeks, more than 22 million Americans. And that's why you're seeing these protests build up across the country saying, boy, we have to reopen as quickly as possible. Do you think that the president's guidelines to the governors are appropriate and and states are ready to begin that process of opening up?
I wouldn't exaggerate the protest across the country. There are some in some places, largely where there's a Democratic governor, but I think of it largely as a distraction, and the president's embrace of it as a distraction from the fact that he has not appropriately done testing, treatment, contact tracing, and quarantine. So, but just to move on from that, that's why we want the small businesses to thrive, and that's why that was such an important part of the CARES package, so that we could, that is the lifeblood of our economy, the creation of jobs, the creation of capital, and the rest. But again, the key that opens the door to the economy is testing, testing, testing. We haven't done it right. If, as Dr. Fauci says, if we proceed in the right way, then we can do that. But we haven't.
Yeah, Dr. Fauci did say the other day that he thought that if we moved in this direction right now, there's enough testing out there for phase 1. You clearly don't agree.
Well, no, he's saying if we proceed. I'm saying we haven't proceeded. That's why we're saying let's proceed in that way with testing. You just can't test. You have to test, treat if people are diagnosed to have it, and contact tracing so that it isn't spread, and quarantine so that people are shelter in place for as long as it takes. And how wonderful the American people are. They understand that we have to have a scientific, evidence-based approach to how we go forward, because we can't just go out there and then find out that we went out too soon. And that has to be calibrated, scientifically based, not politically based or as a distraction to how we should go forward.
You're dealing with this every single day. You have access to the...
So you saw George Stephanopoulos there had that follow-up question about what Anthony Fauci said, that we have enough testing to proceed into phase one if we have, or whatever. She focused on this if we proceed thing, and I didn't even really understand her response. And even though I watched it again in this next clip, I still didn't quite understand. You'll see Chris Wallace brings that up in his initial question to Nancy Pelosi here about what, you're criticizing the president, but about lack of testing, but Anthony Fauci says we have enough testing to get into phase one. And actually, I think the real flaw in or the real loophole or missed danger in what Anthony Fauci said is, he said we have enough to get into phase one, but phase one is not a lot of reopening. Most people, vulnerable people and all sorts of people still have to, there's all sorts of social distancing. A lot of things are still closed. And he's just saying we have enough testing to get into phase one. The question is, do we have enough testing to get into phase two? Nobody asked that question. But anyway, you can see Nancy Pelosi talking to Chris Wallace here about what Anthony Fauci said in terms of sufficient testing. And I will talk about that a little more after we watch that clip from Fox News Sunday together over here.
The day.
The president announced a plan this week to reopen the country, and you immediately criticized it. I want to put up what you said. The White House's vague and inconsistent document does nothing to make up for the president's failure to listen to the scientists and produce and distribute national rapid testing. But Dr. Anthony Fauci endorsed the plan. Take a look.
If these things are done correctly, what I believe they can, we will have and there will be enough tests to allow us to take this country safely through phase one.
Don't you believe Dr. Fauci?
Yeah, well, he said if this were to be done properly, well, it hasn't been done. On March 4th, we passed our first bill, bipartisan, testing. It's over 6 weeks since then, and it hasn't been done. So he's saying if it is done properly, we're already very late on that. But he's right. It has to be testing. It has to be tracing, contact tracing. It has to be treatment, and it has to be quarantine. It's part of something bigger as well to be done properly. But we're way late on it, and that is the failure. The president gets an F, a failure on the testing. But Dr. Fauci's right. If it is done properly, it hasn't been. And that, I think, when he puts it in the if it's done, is an admission that it hasn't been done.
You, as you are right now, have been very critical of President Trump, especially.
So I don't know, did it make sense the second time? No, Dr. Fauci said, if it were done properly, and it hasn't been done properly. I don't think that's what Anthony Fauci said. I think the real caveat in there or whatever is we have enough to safely move into phase one. And phase one is states that have seen a downward trend in their cases can start to do a little bit of reopening. But of course, our ability to see how many cases are in states has to do with the amount of testing. And anyway, I'm going to show more clips on the problems with testing coming up. But the one good thing I thought Nancy Pelosi said in that clip is she said Trump got an F in testing. He failed in testing. So that's why I'm trying to promote that messaging from the Democrat. That's my messaging, my title in my video, Trump fails testing, because if Trump has had, Trump has had many failures in this coronavirus crisis. He's had a failure of character. That's the Trump fails testing of his character, because he is not a good leader. If you watch all of his press conferences, you should be horrified. I'm horrified that that is the leader of our country during this crisis, a malignant narcissist who has no ability to empathize, who makes everything about himself, who lashes out in nasty ways at the reporters trying to do their jobs and cover the story. I mean, even if you don't like their questions, whatever. I'm getting distracted by the nastiness of Donald Trump, and that's probably what he wants. So I'll move on to my Mike Pence clips, and the first one is Chuck Todd. And I talked about how Chuck Todd, his news summary, and especially the package part, which is a pre-recorded news summary that may actually be a script created by his producers, not Chuck Todd. Maybe that's why the news summaries are better than the interviews sometimes. But you saw in the Meet the Press news summary, they talked about how Trump promised to have Google put out this website where everyone could get a test. They even showed the clip from Trump's visit to the CDC on March 6th, where he said everyone who wants a test can get a test. But none of that came up in Chuck Todd's interview with Mike Pence, the vice president, who made some of these promises about millions of tests, or I think it might have been the FEMA guy who said 27 million tests by the end of March. And now you'll see, I'm not showing all of Chuck Todd's interview with Mike Pence where he talked about testing, because he never really, he talked about how governors say they can't get tests, but never really held him to account for promises made, promises not kept on testing. But here's a little bit of that interview, which I will talk about with you after we watch it together over here.
And I just want to clarify one other thing. You said that you believe 5 million tests by the end of April is a success story. The fact that we have yet to that will mean we have yet to test 2% of the population. That is a success story on testing?
Chuck, we believe that under the phase 1 criteria that we have a sufficient amount of testing at that level to allow states to begin to responsibly reopen. Literally doing more than 150,000 tests a day now, a number that we believe we could double once we activate all the laboratories around the country. We're confident that that would enable any governor who's otherwise met the criteria of 14 days of declining cases to be able to have the testing capacity sufficient to monitor people that may have symptoms so we can identify them and do contact tracing, and also deploy the resources to vulnerable populations, nursing homes, and particular vulnerable populations in our city to ensure that we don't see a resurgence of the coronavirus. So yes, we think we've laid a strong foundation for testing for phase 1, and we're going to continue to expand testing going forward for the nation in the weeks and months ahead.
Mr. Vice President, it was nice to see some normalcy yesterday at the graduation ceremony at the Air Force Academy. I think a lot of people are hoping for more and more normalcy when the time is right. Thank you for coming on and sharing the administration's perspective. When we come back, President Trump has left the reopening of states to governors, some of whom are being pressured by what appear to be coordinated anti-social distancing campaigns from the right. I'll talk to two of those governors from Michigan and Ohio next.
And I will have that clip coming up, and kudos to Meet the Press for, like I said, in their news summary and in their coverage, putting these protests in the context of being possibly coordinated by the right wing, and also not in line with NBC News polling that shows that 2/3 of people are more worried about opening up too soon, not opening up too slowly. So that was the good part about what Meet the Press did, but you saw there that Chuck Todd never really cross-examined Mike Pence on all the promises made and not kept that I talked about before I showed the clip. But it wasn't as bad as Chris Wallace's interview of Vice President Mike Pence, where there was not even that much accountability, not even, 5 million tests is a success by the end of April, which was the best question that Chuck Todd asked. But this question is just bizarre because Chris Wallace of Fox News Sunday starts off with this theory that the virus comes from this lab in Wuhan, China, not the so-called wet market, which is just a market with perishable goods. I looked this up this week. Finally, I looked up wet market. A dry market is where there are durable goods. A wet market is where there's, like a farmer's market with fresh produce is a wet market. But there's this theory, it came from the virology lab in Wuhan. I don't know if it's true or not, but that's the beginning of this question. And then Chris Wallace shows this clip of Nancy Pelosi saying Trump is at fault because he called the virus a hoax and said it would magically go away. But then Chris Wallace finishes up his question saying, are we going to hold China accountable? What is the Nancy Pelosi clip doing in the middle of this China question? And Mike Pence, Chris Wallace never even asks about the hoax or the magically go away thing that Nancy Pelosi says in the clip. I don't know if there's the clip of Nancy Pelosi that showed up in this question wasn't what Chris Wallace expected, but it doesn't even make any sense, this question. Even so, it's not really about testing. This is kind of off topic, but I had to show this because it's just bizarre. And if you look at the clip, one of the things Chris Wallace mentions when he shows the Nancy Pelosi clip is he says Nancy Pelosi did mention that Trump put in this China ban that wasn't really a ban because 40,000 people came in. And that's one of the things that Mike Pence emphasizes in his answer is, thanks for mentioning the China ban. Although he doesn't say it wasn't really a ban because 40,000 people came in after the ban. But I'll talk about that a little more after we watch that second Mike Pence clip together from Fox News Sunday together over here.
Several sources now say that the coronavirus originated in a lab in Wuhan and that the Chinese government covered it up for some period of time, which allowed the virus to spread. Now, Speaker Pelosi says while the president imposed his travel ban in January, he minimized the threat from the virus. Here she is, sir.
Instead of calling it a hoax, instead of calling it minimizing it and say it was magically disappeared, we lost time. The delay and the denial caused deaths, and that's just the way it is.
Mr. Vice President, I'm getting this question a lot, and again, I've got to ask you for a brief answer. What specifically is this administration going to do to hold China accountable?
Well, I appreciate you referencing the fact that that by the end of January of this year, President Trump took the unprecedented step of suspending all travel from China. No American president had ever done that. And there's no question, all of our health experts agree that that bought us an invaluable amount of time. It's enabled us to save lives and make sure healthcare workers have the resources that they need to meet this moment. But it is clear to us that not only was there a failure by the World Health Organization to communicate to America and the world what was happening in China, but also that China was not as forthcoming as they should have been with America or the world about what was happening.
So are we going to do something,
the president's made it clear. Well, the president's made it clear he's not happy. We're going to make proper inquiries into this at the proper time. But I have to tell you, the one mission that this president has given the White House Coronavirus Task Force is to save lives, to put this coronavirus in the past. We're going to stay focused on that mission. It's one mission and one team. We're going to work with governors across the country in both political parties. And I just want the American people to be encouraged by the fact that we are making progress. We really do see downward trends in cases and in hospitalizations. And we really believe that because of what the American people have done, because of our incredible healthcare workers, that we are together as a nation hastening the day when we will put the coronavirus in the past and get America working again.
Vice President Pence, thank you. Thanks for your time during a very busy period. Please come back, sir.
Thank you, Chris.
So, Chris Wallace did not really commit much journalism in his cross-examination of Mike Pence there or anyone or anywhere else in his interview of Mike Pence. You can see the whole Fox News program at a link I put down in the video description. And am I right about that Nancy Pelosi clip? There was like nothing about the hoax or magically go away thing that she said. Just the whole juxtaposition to the China ban. And Mike Pence talked on and on about the China ban, which wasn't really a ban. And also that came up in Trump's press conference an hour or two before my broadcast, where he talked about that, but he still doesn't really have an answer for, they bought, even Anthony Fauci said that restricting travel, it wasn't really a ban, like 40,000 people came in after the ban from China. But the restriction on travel from China did buy some time. But what did Trump do with that time? What did he do in February? Trump still can't answer the February question, so keep an eye on that. And two clips of Mike Pence. I watched two Mike Pence interviews, and all I could think, well, not all I could think, but one of the things that kept coming back to me is I made all those videos about impeach Trump. Trump deserves to be impeached and removed. And the one thing that I hate to think about when I remember those videos is that guy who we just watched in those last two clips, he would have been president if Trump were impeached and removed. Would he have been better? I mean, at least he wasn't ranting and raving and attacking reporters and he gives a disciplined message. He doesn't give the weird mixed messages of Trump, but still not a big fan of Mike Pence. But you can tell me why you're a fan of Mike Pence down in the comments section if you happen to be a Mike Pence fan. Are there any Mike Pence fans out there? I don't know. I guess Donald Trump is a Mike Pence fan. If you watch his press conferences, he always thanks Mike Pence for the great job he's doing. But I want to move on to Chuck Schumer in the next clip. This is he's the Senate Minority Leader, the top Democrat in the Senate, and he's talking in this clip to Jake Tapper on CNN's State of the Union, talking about this call where Mike Pence was giving that same like double happy talk that you just saw in to senators on this phone call, and on the subject of testing. And Angus King, the independent senator from Maine, just couldn't take it anymore, and he got like irate. And here's Chuck Schumer talking about that and the problems with testing, and I'll talk about that a little more after we watch it together over here.
Let's talk about the testing. You were on the call with Vice President Pence on Friday when Senate Democrats grew increasingly frustrated with the administration's testing response. Did you get any indication from the call that the federal government has a coordinated plan to roll out testing and to make sure governors know where all the tests are?
Okay, well, let me talk about testing. Angus King, who's a mild-mannered Maine guy, was very upset because the president said now testing is up to the states. They've been back and forth on this. We Democrats proposed in this package a $30 billion focused plan on testing. And we proposed three basic things. Money to go into both manufacturing and supply chains to bolster them quickly. We proposed that we make free testing far more widespread. If people avoid testing because they can't afford it, that's not good for the country. And third, we proposed contact tracing. What we need here is the $30 billion, and we need the focus from the president. The governors of our two states who are most impacted say they need federal help. They can't do the testing on their own. You talk to the business community. When Republican and Democratic senators were on with the president a few days ago, the number one call was for more testing and more federal involvement in the testing. You can't have it state by state. Let's say the swabs are made in, and I'm just California, and the machine, the little chemicals are made somewhere else. You need the federal government to focus. Thus far, I believe that the president has not been focused enough on testing. That's what got Angus King so upset. But I think there is huge pressure to do it. I have urged him to use the Defense Production Act to get this money out, the way we've talked, the $30 billion. But at least there ought to be one person appointed in charge and making sure there's a national focus and effort on testing. I'd say this, Jake. Testing is the key. Every expert says it. Today's New York Times, one of the best experts say we only have about a third of the tests we need. We will not be able to get the economy going full-fledged unless we have testing. And we have examples. Korea, South Korea, I think they had a case one day. The first case was within a day of each other in the U.S. and South Korea, the first case. But they did just what we're calling for. They did a massive increase in the number of tests. They did contact tracing. And now South Korea is way over the hump. We must do the same thing for the good of the health of America and the good of the economy. And then just a couple more things. The money for small business, as we said, we had 4 goals in the.
And then he goes into the deal he's trying to make on the next bill to replenish the small business, the PPP small business loans, and to give help to hospitals and maybe small businesses. And like I said, I'm not covering that, but he did a better job than Nancy Pelosi of talking about the testing issue. He did talk about the Defense Production Act. He did talk about swabs. He almost talked about reagents. I think he said little chemicals. Is that what he said? I think he meant reagents. And so that was all good. But I do think that there was a better job done by some of the governors I'm going to get to in a minute. But before I get to that, I want to show the last the last 5 clips after this next clip are governors. But I want to show Deborah Birx talking about testing, and she makes sort of a reference to the Bayesian analysis I talked about last week, that if the specificity, which talks about the number of false positives, is higher than the prevalence of the virus in the population, you get this situation where more people have false positives than have true positives. And I will talk about that a little more after I show George Stephanopoulos first giving an introduction on testing here, on governors complaining about testing, and then how Deborah Birx responds to his questioning, talking about the same thing, the other good thing Chuck Schumer said in that last clip, that we need triple the testing that we have now. There's a Harvard study that George Stephanopoulos talks about in his questioning of Deborah Birx. And anyway, I'll talk about all of that a little more with you after we watch that ABC News This Week with George Stephanopoulos clip together over here.
We have to have robust testing of the general public.
The more we can do testing, the more we can get people confidence up, the more places like the airports and the airlines are going to be able to come back.
Testing is the single most important topic for us to understand, I think. Testing is how you monitor the rate of infection and you control for it. And that is the whole tension in reopening.
A series of governors talking about the importance of testing in this for COVID as we escalate our response here in the United States. And we're joined now by the coronavirus response coordinator from the White House, Dr. Deborah Birx. Dr. Birx, thank you for joining us this morning. We just heard those governors talk about the importance of testing right there. The president said it's going very, very well at his press conference yesterday. But researchers with the COVID testing project up at Harvard has said that we need to triple the daily amount of testing in the United States in order to get us on a path towards reopening in May, more like 500 to 700,000 a day rather than about 150,000 a day. Are they right, and what's it going to take to get there?
Well, thank you, and good morning. So I think there's three aspects of how to monitor the spread of COVID. And I understand one of those critical legs in the stool is testing. But the other two legs are really making sure that we're monitoring using our syndromic and our influenza-like illness. It's up on the CDC website. Every state has that capacity. And making sure that they're monitoring those two elements at the same time that we're expanding testing. Because I want to be very clear to the American people, none of our tests are 100% sensitive and specific. What do I mean by that? None of our tests that we use in medicine can diagnose 100% of the people who are positive and correctly diagnose 100% of the people who are negative. These are very good tests, but if you utilize them in what we call very low prevalence states where there's no evidence of COVID-19, you can both have false negatives and false positives. So we're working with every governor and every mayor and frankly every laboratory to ensure that we have quality tests out there and also to ensure that we're meeting with the government and with the governors the needs that they have in each of those labs. And so the solutions need to be tailored to each of the issues that each of the labs may have.
But what the governors are saying, though, is that we need national coordination of that entire effort to make sure the supplies are getting where they need.
So first, I just want to remind everyone that 4 weeks ago, we were working off of the pandemic platform that had been developed for pandemic flus. And we realized, and the president realized, that we had to change completely how we were doing testing. And that's why we brought in the diagnostic companies that really work on novel tests and brought in the large commercial labs. And I think you could see from the diagrams yesterday that almost 60% of the tests to date have been done by these large commercial labs. But we've also put out an additional 7 platforms for additional tests to make it possible for hospitals to test and clinics to test. And I think what we don't have right now is complete reporting. So when you look at the number of cases that have been diagnosed, you realize that there's probably 30 to 50,000 additional tests that are being done that are being reported right now. But we also understand that there have been specific issues at specific labs. And to find those solutions, you've got to do it in a granular, fact-based, data-driven way. So we have a team calling every single laboratory that has all these platforms throughout the United States. There's over thousands of them and over 300 labs. And they're calling every one to work with each state and local authority to ensure that they have everything that they need to turn on full capacity, which will, we believe, double the number of tests that are available for Americans.
So first, like I said before, I showed the clip. There's this thing about the specificity and sensitivity of tests. That's basically how many false positives and how many false negatives there are from the test. And what Deborah Birx was saying in that clip was kind of what I was talking about last week about this Bayesian analysis, where if there's low prevalence of the virus in your population and it's lower than your false positive rate, then more of your positives are going to be false than true. Like, for example, say you have like 3% of the population has the virus, and your test is 96% accurate in the specificity, so there's a 4% false positive rate, but only 3% of the people in the population have the virus. So you test 100 people, leaving aside the false negative rate for a minute, say you get the 3 people out of the 100 who have the virus as your true positives, you're also going to get 4 people who don't have the virus. That's your 4%, 96% accuracy, so 4% false positives. So 4 of the people are going to be false positives, only 3 are going to be true positives, because only 3%. Now, if like 50% of the population has the virus, then you're going to get 50 true positives and still those 4 false positives. But that means almost all the positives are true. And that's what Deborah Birx was saying in terms of if there's low prevalence in the population, the tests aren't as good. And that's especially true for the antibody test. I talked about last week how the Celix test actually has like a 4.5% false positive rate, and that's why you can't use it if there's only a 3% prevalence of the virus in your population. But the one other thing I want to say about Deborah Birx, she was interviewed on a couple shows, and no one asked her about this clip that I uploaded on Friday from the Thursday press conference where Deborah Birx admitted there was this money profit motive that was stopping 1 million extra tests per week. And I actually watched All In with Chris Hayes, or Chris Hayes did a special show at 6 p.m. Pacific time right before I started my live stream. And actually it's in the background of the bonus Dash and Sandy clip I'm going to show you at the end. But Andrew Slavitt was a guest on there, and he added some extra context to this, although they didn't reference this clip from Deborah Birx, which I'll show before I talk about what Andrew Slavitt said. But this is the clip that I uploaded on Friday, titled "Money Profit Motive Behind Lack of Testing Admits Dr. Deborah Birx." Yada yada yada. I don't want to read the whole title. It'd be longer than the clip itself, which I will talk about with you a little more after we watch together over here.
Heard me talk about tests for a while from the podium, and I think what has happened over the last several weeks is hospitals and clinics that could move to the more point-of-care test move to those point-of-care tests. And what it's left is an amazing array of capacity that exists in the country for at least 1 million more tests per week. So we have a whole team working lab by lab to see what it would take to turn on all of those labs that aren't running the pieces of equipment now. So you see in the system, I just said to you, there's 1 million more tests per week, that we have tests sitting there and equipment sitting there, and now we have to really deal with each single lab to really figure out what they need. And I just want to thank Administrator Verma, Seema Verma, who went through with us, and thanks to the lab directors, they really explained to us highly technical difficulty to run some of these big pieces of equipment, because you have to aliquot the samples, you have to centrifuge, you have to put them on the machine. It takes a tech full time. At $50 a test, it wasn't enough to hire another technician to run the machine full time. So at $100 a test, it is. So those are the kinds of changes we have to make bit by bit by bit. But that alone doubles our testing capacity per week.
That alone doubles our testing capacity per week, going from $100 a test, from $50 a test. So it's just a question of money and profit for these private labs. And what Andrew Slavitt said on MSNBC on the Chris Hayes show that was on 6 p.m. Pacific before I started my live stream is he said a lot of these labs were getting compensated by Medicare at like $25 or $30 per test, but that's just been raised to $100 a test, which should be able to get an extra 1 million tests per week. But why is that just happening now, and why is that the barrier to testing an extra 1 million tests per week? That is kind of ridiculous. But I want to show another clip before I give more commentary. This is Chuck Todd talking to two governors, one Republican, one Democratic governor. This is the governor of Ohio, Mike DeWine, and the governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer, both talking about the need for swabs and reagents. And, you know, I've watched not just all of Donald Trump's press conferences, but pretty much all. I might have missed one or two of Andrew Cuomo's press conferences, but I think I've watched pretty much all of them. And one thing he's talked about over and over again is how there are these high throughput machines that these different private corporations make, and if you buy their machine, you got to get their swabs and their vials and their reagents, and there are like a dozen of these companies, and you have to order just those reagents and vials and swabs from that company, and no one is like coordinating all of it. And you'll see some of that come through in this interview that Chuck Todd does with both the Republican governor of Ohio and the Democratic governor of Michigan, both complaining about the lack of testing in the clip I will talk about with you a little more after we watch it together over here.
Welcome back. On both coasts and now in the Midwest, governors are forming regional coalitions to figure out how and when to begin the tricky task of slowly reopening their states. At the same time, demonstrations have broken out across the country, particularly in the Midwest, by protesters demanding states loosen their coronavirus restrictions and allow people to get back to work soon. Two governors who have seen some protests in their states are with us this morning, Democrat Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan and Republican Mike DeWine of Ohio. Governors Whitmer and DeWine, welcome back to Meet the Press.
Thanks, Chuck.
I want to start with something that the vice president said, and I want to confirm it with you all. He says that every state has enough testing capacity and enough equipment to begin enough testing to get through phase one. Governor DeWine, is that true in Ohio?
Well, first of all, Chuck, we've had a great partnership with the president and vice president. 3 weekends ago, I called the president about a real problem we had about sterilizing mask, the N95 mask, and that was an FDA problem, and the president got that done. Our big problem today, I could probably double, maybe even triple testing in Ohio virtually overnight if the FDA would prioritize companies that are putting a slightly different formula together for the extraction reagent kit. And if the FDA would do that, we have a shortage, worldwide shortage of some of the materials that go into this. So we really need help. Anybody in the FDA is watching. This would really take our capacity up, literally, Chuck, overnight. And that's what we need to get moving in Ohio.
All right, there's the answer in Ohio. You need more federal help. Governor Whitmer, do you have enough right now, or testing, both capacity and equipment, to have enough testing to do this phase one guideline?
Well, similar to Ohio, I think part of the story in Michigan is we have the capacity to double or triple the number of tests that we are doing, but we need some of these supplies. The reagents and the swabs are absolutely essential. You can't process all these tests if you can't take the sample and protect it and move forward through testing. And so while our capabilities are there, these important supplies are not. And that's, I think, one of the points that you were making in your interview, is that if the federal government would use the Defense Production Act and say we're going to make every swab people need, and we're going to expedite creation of the reagents, we would be able to know how prevalent COVID-19 is. It would take down the risk associated with taking actions to re-engage parts of our economy, because we would have a lot more data about how prevalent COVID-19 still is in our states.
All right, let's talk about the issue.
And that's something important to remember when you see the number of cases. It's the number of known cases that you see flashed on the screen in all those news summaries. If you watch the cable news networks, especially MSNBC, always has a graphic of the number of cases in the U.S. and, by state, and then globally by country. And that's, the number of known cases based on these tests, although there are some presumed cases in terms of deaths that have been added in the United States recently. That's why the New York numbers jumped up like 3,000 deaths in one day, because they added all these presumed but untested deaths. But we don't really know the number of cases without a lot more testing. And you saw Gretchen Whitmer make that point, and even the Republican governor of Ohio started off, trying to say nice things about what Trump's been doing, but had to admit that there are problems with testing. And you heard about swabs and reagents. And I'm going to next show you three governors. That was two governors on NBC News' Meet the Press, one Republican, one Democratic. Whining Sandy next to me while I'm trying to talk here. But I will have a bonus Dash and Sandy clip. Not Sandy whining, but Dash and Sandy together. But two governors on NBC News' Meet the Press. Now I'm going to show you 3 governors, 1 Republican and 2 Democrats, on CNN's State of the Union with Jake Tapper, starting with the Republican from Maryland, Larry Hogan, also criticizing the lack of testing, which I will talk about with you after we watch that clip together. Settle down. Settle down, Sandy. I'll try to settle Sandy down while we watch this clip together over here.
We're not going hungry.
The first thing you've called for in order to reopen your state is an expansion of testing capacity. I want you to take a listen to what the Vice President and President Trump have said on that issue.
We believe today that we have the capacity in the United States to do a sufficient amount of testing for states to move into phase 1 at the time and manner that they deem to be appropriate.
As our experts said yesterday, America's testing capability and capacity is fully sufficient to begin opening up the country totally.
Governor Northam just called that delusional, the idea that states have enough testing. What do you think? Do you have enough testing to move into phase 1?
I think this is probably the #1 problem in America, and has been from the beginning of this crisis, the lack of testing. And I've repeatedly made this argument to the leaders in Washington on behalf of the rest of the governors in America. And I can tell you, I talk to governors on both sides of the aisle nearly every single day. The administration, I think, is trying to ramp up testing. They are doing some things with respect to private labs, but to try to push this off to say that the governors have plenty of testing and they should just get to work on testing, somehow we aren't doing our job, is just absolutely false. Every governor in America has been pushing and fighting and clawing to get more tests, not only from the federal government, but from every private lab in America and from all across the world. And we continue to do so. Look, we've increased our testing in Maryland by 5,000% over the past month, but it's nowhere near where it needs to be. And as Governor Northam said a moment ago, there are things like shortages on swabs that we don't have anywhere in America. You can't do the test without. On reagents, which is a part of the test. So, look, I think they've made some strides at the federal level. I think states are all working hard on their own to find their own testing. Lab capacity has been increasing, but it's not accurate to say there's plenty of testing out there and the governor should just get it done. That's just not being straightforward.
Protesters gathered in the state capitol.
I thought I put these clips in order, but I guess the Ralph Northam clip should have come first, but that's not the order I put them in. I tried to... Looks like Sandy has settled down. You want to see what I was putting up with while I was watching the live clip with you? Look at this. I recorded that during the clip we just watched together. But Sandy settled down, and she actually whined a little bit more after I stopped the clip there. But sorry about the distractions there. That's what you get when you do a live show with a silly puppy to your left, I guess. But I guess the Ralph Northam clip was supposed to be clip 16, and I was going to show you Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan, next. But since I guess Ralph Northam was earlier in the program, here's Ralph Northam saying that Trump is delusional, which I will discuss with you a little more after we watch that brief clip together over here.
The president and vice president have been saying over the past few days that the U.S. has enough testing capacity for states to begin opening back up if you feel you're ready to go into phase 1. Is that the case in Virginia? Do you have enough tests to do the tests you need to do?
Jake, that's just delusional to be making statements like that. We have been fighting every day for PPE, and we've got some supplies now coming in. We've been fighting for testing. It's not a straightforward test. We don't even have enough swabs, believe it or not, and we're ramping that up. But for the national level to say that we have what we need, and really to have no guidance to the state levels, it's just irresponsible because we're not there yet.
All right, Governor Northam, thank you so much for your time. Come back. We'd love to.
So, yeah, that was the delusional clip. If you're wondering, Jake Tapper did not ask Ralph Northam about the whole blackface controversy, which Trump tries to bring up when he talks about Virginia without saying it, but saying he's under siege, he's in big trouble. Anyway, I don't want to go into all that, but the last CNN State of the Union clip I want to show you is Jake Tapper talking to Gretchen Whitmer, who you saw earlier. I guess in some ways she's trying out to be a vice president for Joe Biden, his running mate. She's one of the 5 or 6 people talked about since Joe Biden said he's going to pick a woman as his running mate. Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan, is on the list, and here's Jake Tapper asking her about the testing problems, and I think this starts off with a good graph of per capita testing. One of the things I see Trump doing all the time is he talks about, more testing. We're doing more testing than any country, but he doesn't say per capita. And when they do talk about per capita testing, they do this weird, dishonest thing like in New York, we're doing more testing per capita than any country in the world, but in the United States, we're not doing more testing per capita. And that's the graph that starts this questioning of Gretchen Whitmer from Jake Tapper on CNN State of the Union this morning over here.
Governor, you said that testing is an essential piece of fighting the virus. We have a chart up here of the states with at least 1,000 coronavirus deaths, and Michigan is next to last with just over 1,000 tests per 100,000 residents. That's just half or a third of the number in other hotspots such as New York, Louisiana, Massachusetts. The Trump administration says that all governors, have enough tests. Why is testing still so low per capita in your state? How long do you think it will be until you have enough infrastructure set up to test, isolate, contact trace in order to reopen?
Well, right now I can tell you we could double or even triple the number of tests that we're executing daily if we had the swabs and reagents. And I know you talked to Governors Northam and Hogan before I came on, and they're saying the exact same thing. This is not a unique situation in Michigan, but the crisis that we're confronting is unique, and that's precisely why it would really be incredibly helpful if the federal government would use the Defense Production Act to start making these swabs and reagents so we can improve testing. Even by their own guidelines, they say that you should have 14 days of decline growth, that you should be able to test. But their gating criteria says only testing for high-risk healthcare providers. That's not nearly enough. You talk to any epidemiologist and they tell you we should be testing between 1% and 2% of our population regularly. And that's precisely why we need these fundamental supply chain issues addressed so we can ramp up our testing and have some confidence in the numbers and know when it's safe to engage and be able to track folks after we have started to re-engage parts of our economy.
I've heard from people in the administration that one of the issues is that there are millions of tests out there that have been sent to states, but that the governors don't even know that those tests are in the states, not necessarily through any fault of the governors. Is that one of the problems here, that tests are being put out on the market, but you're not even being informed about it?
Well, in some cases, yeah, we will get tests into our healthcare providers, and it's, we're dependent on them to let us know that that's happened. That's not a great way to run this system. It would be nice if we had a national strategy that was working with the state so every state knew precisely what was coming in. But at the end of the day, we governors are doing the best we can with what we've got. We could use some assistance, though, to make sure that those supply chain issues are addressed and we can do the robust testing that every epidemiologist in our country tells you is absolutely essential as we prepare to think about re-engaging sectors of our economy.
Governor Gretchen Whitmer, thank you so much for your time. Hope.
So anyway, I think I introduced that clip well enough, what do you think about Gretchen Whitmer? Would she be a good vice presidential running mate for Joe Biden against Donald Trump? I haven't really covered the presidential race because of the whole pandemic, but one of the things that happened this week is that Joe Biden wrapped up the nomination got endorsed by Bernie Sanders and President Obama, and that's something I could cover at some point, but I want to get to the final news clip for the broadcast tonight, and this is from CBS News' Face the Nation. I criticized their news summary earlier for being Fox News Light, covering the protests as if they were showing some huge movement in the United States when it's like 2/3, like I've said over and over again, for afraid we're opening up too fast versus the 1/3 who are protesting. But at least Margaret Brennan did bring up the mixed messages from Trump on, total power versus leaving it up to the states. And this is a question to Charlie Baker, the governor of Massachusetts, who does kind of bring up testing in the final news clip that I will discuss with you after we watch together over here.
Dr. Birx, she's very concerned about what's happening in your state, which is experiencing such an outbreak right now. I want to ask you about how states are working with the federal government, because the president said this week he has the ultimate authority to make the decision to reopen. That same day, you and a number of governors throughout the Northeast announced you're going to come up with your own regional strategy. The White House has now said, OK, you're in charge of it anyhow. Do these mixed messages impact your planning? Do you as a governor need more federal guidance?
Well, I guess the first thing I'd say is part of the reason we chose to join that collaborative is there's a tremendous amount of cross-border activity that takes place when there is a functioning economy between and among all those states in the Northeast. We have people who work in those states. We have people who live in those states and work in Massachusetts. We have tons of companies that do business back and forth. And I think us thinking about this regionally is an important element, because I don't want Massachusetts to do something that makes life incredibly complicated for New York or New Jersey or New Hampshire or Vermont. And I certainly don't want them to do something that unwittingly creates issues and problems in Massachusetts. I think generally the biggest thing we're interested in guidance from the feds on is a lot of the stuff that comes out of the CDC and the FDA, which we take very seriously, incorporate into our own guidance and our own advisories, and in some cases orders that we issue in Massachusetts. I know that's true for many other states. I also think the other issue that's important from the feds is they approve and drive a lot of the policy and what ultimately becomes sort of the facts on the ground with respect to testing and treatments. And in a state where there are a number of companies that are deeply invested in either the development of treatments or vaccines, or have hospitals that are involved in clinical trials associated with treatments for COVID-19, the federal government's role with respect to treatments is enormously important. And on the testing piece, they fundamentally have a huge role to play.
For testing?
Pardon me?
Do you need that national strategy for testing?
I think generally speaking, governors appreciate the fact that the feds have acknowledged that the surge is in different places in different states at different times. We're in a very different place here in Massachusetts than other states are. We're right in the middle of the surge now. But I certainly believe that the more guidance and especially the ability to put the foot on the accelerator with respect to advancements in testing, everything associated with testing ultimately has to be approved by the CDC and the FDA, as it should be. States shouldn't be making their own decisions on that stuff.
Well, one decision you have made in your state is...
So there, Charlie Baker, the governor of Massachusetts, makes the important point that the federal government should be in the driver's seat on testing, because the FDA, a federal agency, has to approve. I had the FDA Commissioner Stephen Hahn in clips multiple times in the last few weeks. He wasn't on the shows this week, but the FDA has to approve all that testing, and the antibody testing, the diagnostic testing, the swab testing, and getting the swabs, the reagents, the vials, all that stuff. That is the continuing story of Trump's failure on testing that I hope you enjoyed the way I covered this week with all the clips I picked out. I appreciate all of you who have been watching the program as live viewers, especially the Super Chat contributors. Wait, what's going on here? Let me see if I can get this. Why won't it? wants to like add in somewhere that, wait, try it there. Here are my Super Chat contributors. If you want to contribute during the recorded show, there are links down in the video description to join Patreon as a patron and also there's a join button below the video where you can become a channel member on YouTube. At various levels that are described therein, you can get a hashtag LiberalViewer weatherproof vinyl sticker at like the $5 level on Patreon or $5 level on PayPal, or $10 you get the sticker and the ACLU Constitution. This is the Constitution that Trump has never read. So you read it and you will be one up on Donald Trump. And before I finish the live stream, I did promise that I was going to show you a bonus Dash and Sandy clip with Chris Hayes live on MSNBC at 6 p.m. Pacific in the background. This is kind of where I got that Andy Slavitt clip talking about Medicare reimbursements not being enough to get all the extra million tests a week done. And anyway, when I was trying to get a Dash and Sandy clip, where do I go? I go to the food bowl and the water bowl. This was dinner time for Sandy, and Dash coming along. You'll see partway through, I fill Sandy's bowl with food, and Sandy pushes Dash out of the way in the final clip that I will probably not talk about with you at all after we watch together over here. And that's the bonus Dash and Sandy clip. Thanks for watching. I'm way over time this week, and I appreciate the live viewers, the recorded show viewers. I will be back next Sunday and every Sunday for the foreseeable future, and if I have some reason to upload some kind of video during the week, like I did on Friday, showing the money profit motive behind the lack of testing, I will do that in the future, so look for that if you want to check during the week. But I will be back next Sunday, and until then, I guess I will be seeing all of you around the internet.